I call the member for Maitland.
Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker. And I thank the Minister for Prevention of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault for her comments there. And I rise to speak on the Crimes, Domestic and Personal Violence Amendment, National Domestic Violence Orders Recognition Bill 2016. And I endorse the contribution of my colleague, the Shadow Attorney-General, Member for Liverpool, on this bill and add my support for the bill to go through. But I would like to make some comments on it, and I think it is good to hear that we're now talking about these ADVOs, the Apprehended Domestic Violence Orders, in this place, because this bill to some extent is setting up a streamlining for the paperwork of a system which is failing women in their own state. It's got no time frame for its full implementation, and there are still a lot of issues to do with information sharing which will have impacts on that. There's a substantial body of evidence, Mr Acting Speaker, regarding the difficulty that women in our community have in accessing apprehended domestic violence orders, in enforcing them and getting appropriate domestic violence services due to the shortages of spaces in refuges and a lack of 24/7 response from refuges because of funding cuts to them. It's important to note that even if a 24/7 response was available in these refuges, there would be no capacity for extra women to be housed in them as they don't have enough spaces as it is. If government can't guarantee the safety of women who choose to stay at home, if we can't get adequate monitoring on their homes and on perpetrators, and if women have such difficulty in obtaining and enforcing ADVOs or seeking shelter that they think that it's better off for them to leave the state, this is a real shame for our community. It's not enough to increase the portability of ADVOs if the recommendations to approve their operation are being ignored. And this brings me to the New South Wales Domestic Violence Review Team report. Now, that team was set up by Labor in 2010, and it didn't sit for a long period in 2014. And there has been very little action in terms of that team in the monitoring and reporting on the recommendations of that report. In fact, there are about 8 recommendations from that report over the years, from 2011-12, 2013-15, which go straight to the heart of the operation of ADVOs and would be quite integral in terms of improving outcomes for women who are escaping domestic violence. The government really needs to show a real commitment to reducing the deaths from domestic violence, because I have to note that an annual report that's being released every 2 years shows a half attempt at addressing the issue. The Attorney-General's second reading speech refers to the impending New South Wales pilot implementation of the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, or Clare's Law as it's known in the United Kingdom. Now, there's a lot of ambivalence in the sector about the efficacy of this scheme, and that is because the evaluations were really on the process of that scheme rather than the outcomes for women. There are high-profile women such as Rosie Batty and other experts in the field of domestic violence have highlighted that the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme doesn't address the fundamental issue that Clare Wood in the UK had, which was that even though she knew about the violence from her partner, even though she knew that he was an abuser, it was the police failing to act on it that was the problem. And when we go back to those domestic violence death review team reports that we've had here in New South Wales, we see that there are recommendations, for example, around reviewing the implementation of legislation that requires police officers to apply for ADVOs wherever they have fears for the safety of victims, and that review should ascertain the extent to which the provision is actually used. Now, the whole of government approach from this government has actually been not to support that recommendation, and yet if we're talking about what we're going to do to make the ADVOs much more, if we go to what that's about and how that is going to actually reduce deaths in this area, then we should certainly be looking at reviewing how they are activated and not just relying on anecdotal evidence or that we think that they're probably being used appropriately. The other issue that we're having with the Domestic Violence Disclosure Law is that in the UK they've estimated the cost of that of being 750 Great British pounds per application, which is quite a lot of money, and when we're not having any additional resources for women who may then need to seek services, so may need to seek services from a refuge or from a domestic violence court advocacy service, you know, we have to think about where we're prioritising the spend in this area. And the other aspect that I think is quite offensive actually in the Attorney General's language around that is that she says in her second reading speech that she's empowering victims to make more informed decisions about their relationships. Women who go into relationships don't see themselves as victims. Early in relationships, women are not necessarily looking to find out if their partners are abusive. It would seem logical that an application would only be made after a situation of abusive behaviour had occurred, when the woman actually already knows that someone's the abuser. So the effectiveness of that to actually help women in abusive relationships is questionable. And the bottom line is that the DVDS, the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, would not actually be necessary if the ADVOs were easier to obtain and more effective. I also want to speak to another issue that the Attorney-General raised in her speech, and that was regarding the Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Services, which spent the first 6 months of this financial year struggling with massive increases in clients as a result of government changes, whereby every single domestic violence report from the police was required to be followed up by the NGO sector with no additional funding in the first instance. So there was a funding increase after much lobbying by the sector by 20% from the 1st of January 2016. However, in the single 3-month period in 2014 to 15, there had been a 75% increase in usage, and there's reports of that increase being up to 200%. So that is a real problem in this area. I think that if we go back for a moment to, continue that on the Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Service, we also need to think that there's 28 services that are servicing 114 local courts in New South Wales. In regional areas like mine, for instance, that's quite difficult. You might have advocacy services having to travel within 2 to 3 hours to actually represent women at court, and if those court cases are delayed, that's an issue. Again, it goes to this idea of having perhaps a specialist domestic violence court, which would be something that Labor has supported in the past. And yeah, so that is really a big problem. And it's also the stress on those workers who must contact women within 1 working day of an incident occurring in order to offer them appropriate safeties and referrals and support. But again, it gets back to if there are no supports available for them, if the funding is not there, if it's been taken off into other aspects of housing rather than in specialist domestic violence cases, then that puts those workers in an incredibly difficult situation. I do note the recommendation of the 2013-2015 Domestic Violence Death Review Team annual report, that 2-year annual report, and recommendation 9 is that there was a number of compliance issues identified by the team for the report, including several instances where police did not record breaches of enforceable ADVOs. This reflects concerns that have been raised in a number of reports previously, and that recommendation is that the New South Wales Police Force investigate additional strategies and processes that will promote increased compliance with policies concerning ADVOs and breaches of ADVOs, and report to the team in relation to those initiatives. And strategies and processes should include the use of the team's case reviews to inform existing training in relation to ADVO compliance. And I note the Minister just now for Prevention of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault talked about the extra 24 domestic violence liaison officers that have been funded, but I do ask the question that I asked of her in the briefing the other day, which is how many of those have actually been recruited and how many of those are on the ground working in our community. The reports I have from the sector are that they are well overrun with cases, and they need assistance and they need bodies on the ground to actually start helping to work in this space. So, Mr Acting Speaker, the opposition does support the bill, but we would like to see the structure around it, the supports for women who are escaping violence, to begin not at the macro level of the Australian government and portability of ADVOs, but actually looking at the situation for women on the ground. How will they be getting those ADVOs? How are we improving that process for women and their experiences, and how are we ensuring that we can keep them safe when indeed they are subject to abuse at the home?